I remember the weight of the bouquet in my hands more vividly than anything else in that moment, as if the fragile stems and tightly bound flowers were the only thing anchoring me to reality when the air inside the hall suddenly shifted. There had been music, light chatter, the rustle of fabric as guests adjusted in their seats, the sweet and steady rhythm of anticipation that usually precedes the moment when two lives are supposed to merge into one. But then, like a candle snuffed out in a single breath, all of it changed. Whispers cut across the rows of chairs, a low, dissonant wave of voices swelling into disbelief. I didn't hear footsteps or see the door swing shut. I only saw the empty space where he should have been, the silence of absence spreading like a stain. Someone gasped. Someone else muttered a name, his name, with disbelief curdling it. And still I stood there, bouquet trembling in my grip, my heart not quite racing, not quite stopping, but hovering in a limbo that felt like the edge of a dream, too cruel to be real. The aisle stretched before me like a cruel joke. The flowers lining it seemed too bright, too artificial now, their petals mocking the promises he and I had painted over the years. My dress clung heavy on my shoulders, suffocating in its perfection, while my mind scrambled to piece together fragments of sense from the shattered mirror of what had just happened. The officiant cleared his throat once, then again, as though the script in his hands had suddenly become meaningless. My mother, seated in the second row, lifted her chin, her eyes darting toward me, searching for a crack, a collapse, something to confirm the fear that was building like smoke among the guests. Yet I did not crumble. Not then. My fingers pressed tighter around the stems until I could feel the sharp bite of thorns beneath the careful wrapping, and it was that pain, subtle and grounding, that kept me still while the whispers rose louder. I had imagined this day 1,000 times, rehearsed in my mind the moment when I would walk forward, when he would turn with eyes shining and we would stand together in a unity witnessed by every soul in that room. Instead, I stood alone, every eye burning into me, every heartbeat in the hall pounding with the question no one dared voice aloud. Why had he left? Some tried to rise, to follow him, to catch a glimpse of where he had gone, but there was no grand scene of a runaway groom sprinting into the distance. There was only the shadow of his absence, a sudden and deliberate vanishing that felt more calculated than panicked. That detail lodged itself quietly in the back of my mind. He hadn't been dragged away. He hadn't been overtaken by nerves in some cinematic wave of cold feet. He had chosen to leave, and in that choice was a clarity that I could not yet voice but instinctively recognized. The bouquet almost slipped from my hands then, the weight of it too much as my arms grew numb with the enormity of the silence. I tightened my grip and lifted it slightly, a motion so small it must have looked like the tremor of a nervous bride to those watching, but inside me it was an oath. I would not let the flowers fall, not let them scatter like symbols of a broken promise across the floor, not give them the satisfaction of watching me collapse alongside the ceremony that had just been abandoned. If he thought walking out minutes before we were to be bound together would shatter me, he underestimated the resilience that years beside him had unknowingly carved into me. The faces before me blurred, a sea of pity, curiosity, even amusement in some cruel corners. I could almost feel their judgments brushing against my skin, the weight of gossip already being shaped into stories that would outlast the fading music of the interrupted ceremony. But their stares became irrelevant, because in that moment, a strange calmness settled over me, colder than fear, sharper than despair. I realized that every person in that room was waiting for me to break, to flee, to confirm the script of the abandoned bride. They wanted a scene they could retell, a tragedy they could embellish. Instead, I inhaled deeply, the scent of roses and lilies filling my lungs like armor, and I stood straighter. The silence deepened because I did not do what they expected. Minutes passed, though they felt like suspended hours, before anyone dared move again. A cousin shifted uncomfortably. The officiant coughed once more, papers shuffling in his hands. My father started to rise, his hand twitching as if to reach for me, but I shook my head imperceptibly, and he froze. This was not his moment to salvage, not anyone's but mine. I wanted them all to see me standing there, bouquet unfallen, spine unbent, even as the man who had sworn vows in private only days before had just humiliated me in the most public way imaginable. Because if there was one thing I knew, even then, it was that this story would not end with me as the victim they expected. The bouquet would not fall. The door remained closed. The whispers eventually dulled, but the imprint of that silence stayed, etched into every corner of the hall. Later, I would think of it as the silence that froze the room, the moment when every guest held their breath waiting to witness a collapse that never came. Instead, that silence became the stage for something else entirely, the first beat of a new rhythm, one that he had set into motion by walking out, but one that I would finish on my own terms. And as the last of the whispers died down, replaced by uneasy stillness, I felt the faintest curve of a smile touch my lips. It wasn't joy, and it wasn't madness. It was the quiet acknowledgement that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. In the hours that followed, when the guests had dispersed in awkward clusters of murmurs, and the hall stood empty with only petals scattered across the floor and half-drunk glasses of champagne left abandoned, my mind began to wander backwards, tracing the long path that had led me to that aisle and to the bouquet that I refused to let fall. I thought of the years I had poured into us, into him, into a relationship that had begun like a spark in a storm, and then settled into what I believed was the steady flame of a lifetime. It is strange how, when confronted with a single act of betrayal, the mind does not simply stay in the present, but insists on unspooling the entire tapestry, thread by thread, as though searching for the exact moment when the rot first began. I found myself remembering our early days, when every word seemed to carry weight, when he looked at me as though I were not only enough but more than he deserved, and I believed him because I wanted to. I remembered the small rituals we built, morning coffee that he claimed he couldn't start the day without if I wasn't the one making it, the walks we took on Sundays when the world felt suspended in a softer light. I remembered how, little by little, those rituals began to falter, replaced by excuses that sounded harmless at first. Late nights at work, sudden meetings, tiredness that kept him from reaching for my hand when once he had done so instinctively. Each memory carried with it a question that burned more fiercely the longer I examined it. How had I not seen? Or worse, had I seen and chosen to look away because the truth would have shattered the life I thought I was building? There had been signs, subtle but insistent. The guarded tone in his voice when his phone buzzed after midnight. The way he angled the screen slightly away from me, not in an obvious gesture of secrecy, but in a way calculated enough to ensure I could not glimpse the messages he claimed were just colleagues. The perfume that lingered faintly on his jacket once, not mine, not anything I wore, but sweet and unfamiliar. When I asked, he laughed, called me imaginative, kissed my forehead with a charm that always seemed to dissolve my questions, and I foolishly accepted. I wanted the dream more than I wanted the truth. I gave him years of myself, years that could have been spent carving out dreams of my own instead of weaving them around his. I supported him when he faltered, reminded him of his worth when he doubted himself, celebrated his victories as though they were mine, because in my heart they were. I made sacrifices silently, shifting my ambitions to fit the contours of his plans, believing that love meant compromise, and that one day, when stability was ours, the balance would tilt back toward me. Yet in those quiet sacrifices lay the seeds of a blindness that grew roots deep enough to keep me from confronting the unease that occasionally rose in me like an unwelcome tide. I told myself I was overthinking, that every couple faces distance, that suspicion was poison, and trust was the cure. What I did not realize was that trust can be a mask, a convenient veil behind which betrayal flourishes unchallenged. Even on the morning of the wedding, when his eyes avoided mine just a fraction too long, when his smile felt rehearsed instead of radiant, I swallowed the chill in my stomach and told myself it was nerves, that every groom falters under the weight of such a day. I pressed the bouquet to my chest, ignoring the prick of thorns that had escaped their wrapping, as if the pain could anchor me to the certainty that everything was as it should be. The truth is, a part of me knew, not in words, not in evidence, but in the quiet instinct that whispers louder than logic, the one I had silenced so many times before. That morning, it screamed, and I smothered it because the thought of walking into that hall without him by my side seemed unthinkable. Hours later, I would realize that was exactly what fate had carved for me. The waste of it all pressed heavy on me. Not just the years, but the dreams entwined within them. The plans we had made for a home that would now never exist. The children we spoke of with names we had whispered in the dark. The trips we promised each other when finances allowed. Every vision I had painted of the future seemed to collapse like glass struck by a hammer. Sharp fragments scattered across the floor of my memory. Yet even as the sting of betrayal cut through me, there was another voice, quieter but resolute, reminding me that those years were not lost. I had not been idle. I had lived. I had loved. I had given deeply. And though he had squandered what I gave, the truth of what I had built within myself could not be stolen. Still, I could not ignore the bitterness. I replayed moments where the signs had been too loud to miss. The time he canceled dinner because of a last-minute project, yet posted a photo the next day at a bar with people I had never met. The way he bristled when I mentioned a woman's name from his office, dismissing my concern with irritation sharp enough to silence me. All of these were warnings I had buried, because the alternative, believing he was unfaithful, unworthy, untrue, was too painful. The irony that I stood in an empty hall abandoned minutes before a ceremony meant to solidify trust was not lost on me. The truth had always been there, waiting for me to stop averting my gaze. So I sat in that silence after the guests had gone, the bouquet still resting in my lap, and let myself feel the full weight of years I had given him, not as wasted time, but as lessons etched in scars I would carry forward. The signs I ignored were now illuminated in cruel clarity, but with that clarity came something unexpected: resolve. Because if I could endure years of slow erosion without breaking, then the collapse of a single ceremony could not undo me. If anything, it unveiled the truth I had been too blind to face, and in doing so, it freed me. What he believed was my ruin had become the opening of a door I had been too afraid to touch. The hall remained still, empty but not lifeless, as though the very air held witness to my decision. I would not let those years define me as a victim. I would let them sharpen me into someone he had underestimated, someone he had never truly known. And as the last flicker of candlelight dimmed, I rose, the bouquet still unfallen, my heart heavy yet unbroken, ready to step into what came next, not with despair, but with the cold clarity of a woman who had finally stopped ignoring the truth. Long before the doors of the wedding hall closed behind him, before the gasps and whispers of guests rippled like a wave through the silence he left in his absence, I had felt the shadow that clung to his movements, the faint presence of something, or someone, that existed in the spaces between us. It was not a sudden revelation that struck me on that day, but rather the culmination of countless moments in which suspicion had brushed against the edges of my awareness, only for me to push it aside in the name of trust, love, or simply fear of confirming what I did not want to know. When he left, vanishing just minutes before he was meant to say words that should have bound us together, it did not feel like abandonment born of sudden nerves. It felt deliberate, rehearsed, as though he had been walking toward that decision for far longer than I had dared to admit. I recalled the evenings when he would come home late, the excuse always tethered to work, to deadlines, to the weight of responsibilities that I was meant to understand. At first I believed him, because believing him was easier than imagining alternatives. But there were small tells. His cologne stronger than usual, his shirt tucked hastily into his trousers as though pulled on in a rush, the faintest smudge of lipstick once that he brushed off with laughter, calling it a reflection from a client's glass of wine. The stories he told grew less coherent over time, yet my silence gave them room to thrive. There was also the tone in his voice when he mentioned her name, a colleague introduced once in passing, her presence always woven casually into anecdotes, her laughter punctuating his stories, until it became impossible to ignore the pattern. He spoke of her more than he spoke of us, though he would never admit it. I smiled. I nodded. I pretended not to notice the warmth in his voice that once had been reserved only for me. By the time the wedding approached, the truth had grown too loud to ignore, yet I clung to the image of what we were supposed to be. The preparations, the dress fittings, the endless calls with the planner, all of it became a shield against the nagging thought that perhaps he was preparing for something else entirely. There were whispers, subtle ones, from people who had no reason to lie. A friend told me she had seen him at a cafe, seated across from someone who did not look like a business partner. Another admitted she had overheard his name in hushed conversation, attached to speculation that did not align with the man he claimed to be. Each account was a piece of a puzzle I was too afraid to complete. And yet, even as I drowned in doubt, I prepared myself in quiet ways. I began to keep copies of things I once would have ignored: receipts, emails, photographs tucked into folders on my computer under names that would mean nothing to anyone else. I had not fully planned what I would do with them, only that I would not let myself be blindsided should the day ever come when the shadow stepped fully into the light. On the morning of the wedding, when I looked into his eyes and saw not love but calculation, it was as though my instincts screamed in recognition of the truth I had already catalogued in secret. He was not fleeing from me alone. He was running toward her, or toward the life he had built in parallel, one that mocked every promise he had whispered into my ear. The shadow of his exit was not just betrayal. It was validation of every suspicion I had swallowed. I remembered the message I had glimpsed once when his phone lit up beside him. A name saved under something deliberately ordinary: Tom Office, though the words that followed in the preview were anything but masculine. He had snatched the phone quickly, smiled too broadly, kissed my hand as though to erase the moment. I had laughed it off, told myself paranoia was unbecoming. Now, in the echo of his absence, I saw it clearly for what it was: a mask, a poorly constructed one, hiding what I had known deep down all along. The whispers of the guests in the hall had not been for me alone. I realized later they were echoes of what some had already suspected. People had noticed, people had talked, and I had been the last to let myself believe. His exit was not a man overwhelmed by fear of commitment. It was the final act of a man who thought he could walk away from one life and step seamlessly into another, leaving me as collateral damage. But what he had not counted on was that my silence had not been ignorance. It had been patience. As I sat in the empty hall after the chaos had ebbed, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth fully. I was not blindsided, not truly. The shadow had always been there, cast long and heavy across our relationship, and I had simply chosen not to stare into it until he forced me to. Now, with the bouquet still intact in my grip, and the silence heavy with judgment and pity, I realized the shadow no longer frightened me. It gave me clarity. He had left me for her, or perhaps for the idea of freedom she represented, but in doing so he had revealed the cowardice at his core. And while he thought walking away minutes before our vows would make me crumble, it only unveiled the strength I had buried beneath layers of denial. The truth I suspected was now undeniable. He was not the man he pretended to be, not the partner he had promised, not the future I had invested my years in, but in stepping into the shadow, he had freed me from it, and with that freedom came a resolve sharper than any pain he had intended to inflict. He thought his exit was an ending. He did not yet realize it would become my beginning, the first movement in a story he would never control. When the silence of the hall settled into my bones and the bouquet weighed heavy in my hands, I understood that I was standing at a crossroads that would define not only this day but the rest of my life. Every instinct society had pressed upon me whispered that I should collapse, should retreat behind tears and trembling, should embody the abandoned bride who becomes the cautionary tale whispered at future gatherings. Yet as I looked at the empty aisle before me, at the expectant eyes still burning with curiosity, even as they prepared to leave, I felt something else stirring, something colder, sharper, and infinitely stronger. It was the refusal to let him dictate my story. He had walked out minutes before a ceremony that was meant to honor commitment, and in doing so, he believed he had scripted the narrative of my humiliation. What he did not know was that I had already chosen not to give him that satisfaction. The first breath I took after the door closed behind him was shallow, ragged, as if grief were waiting to seize me. But the second breath was steady, deliberate, and filled with an awareness I had never felt before. I remembered the years I had given him, the signs I had ignored, the shadow I had finally acknowledged, and all of it crystallized into a single undeniable truth. I had wasted enough time being blind. I would not waste another moment being weak. My choice was not to collapse, but to act. And though I did not yet know the exact shape my actions would take, the decision itself lit a flame inside me that no amount of betrayal could extinguish. I saw the pity in their faces, the relatives shifting uncomfortably in their seats, the friends whispering among themselves, the murmurs that framed me as the victim of an unthinkable cruelty. But beneath the pity was something worse. Anticipation. They wanted to see the spectacle of my breakdown, the tears staining the white of my gown, the desperate retreat of a woman undone. They were hungry for it because it would make the story easier to tell later, cleaner in its tragedy. And so I denied them. I straightened my spine, lifted the bouquet that had almost fallen, and forced the corners of my lips into a curve that was not joy, but defiance. I let them watch me stand, unbroken, until the silence grew heavier than any scream could have been. Inside me, the shift was subtle, but irreversible. I thought of all the nights I had rehearsed his vows in my head, the promises he would make and the promises I would give in return, and I realized those vows had already been shattered long before this day. If he had wanted to humiliate me, he would have needed me to surrender to despair, to confirm with my own weakness that I was broken. But as I stood there, bouquet pressed to my chest, I realized that the humiliation was not mine. It was his. He had fled in fear, in cowardice, in pursuit of shadows, and in doing so, he revealed himself not as a man who had left me, but as a man unworthy of standing beside me. The choice to act was not about revenge. Not yet. It was about survival, about reclaiming the agency he thought he had stolen. I began, even then, to plot quietly. I knew where the proof was. The receipts, the emails, the photographs I had tucked away when suspicion first whispered to me. I knew that the story he thought he controlled was one I could turn inside out, exposing not my shame but his duplicity. But for that moment, my action was silence, deliberate and commanding, a silence that declared I was not broken. I was waiting. And though he may have believed the wedding was the climax of our story, I understood now that it was only the prologue of something greater, something he could not predict. When the guests finally began to file out, their eyes still darting toward me as though afraid to look too long at the wound, I remained where I was, refusing to be ushered away like someone fragile. I listened to the echo of their footsteps fade, each one carrying away a version of the story that they would repeat in kitchens and phone calls and quiet gossip. Let them. Their words would never capture the truth that had settled in me, that I was not a woman destroyed, but a woman sharpened by betrayal. Later, when I stood alone in front of the mirror, still wearing the dress meant for vows that would never be spoken, I studied my reflection carefully. The face looking back at me was pale but resolute, the eyes red but burning with a fire I had never seen before. I thought of the years, the sacrifices, the signs, and the shadow that had followed me, and I whispered to myself the only vow that mattered now. I will not let him define me. The words tasted bitter at first, but then they settled like iron, and I knew they would hold. The choice not to collapse was the first true act of freedom I had taken in years. I had lived so long in the orbit of his presence, tethered to his moods, his ambitions, his lies, that I had forgotten the weight of my own agency. Standing in the ruins of what should have been a beginning, I rediscovered it, and with that rediscovery came resolve. I would act, not impulsively, not recklessly, but with the precision of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to claim. He thought leaving me before the altar would be the end of my story. In truth, it was only the end of his power over it. From that moment on, every step I took, every plan I made, every word I spoke would be my own, sharpened into a weapon he would never see coming. And as I placed the bouquet gently on the table beside me, not discarded but carefully set down, I smiled again, this time not in defiance but in promise. He had chosen his path, and now I would choose mine. And mine would not be the path of collapse, it would be the path of action. Even before the ceremony, long before the whispers and the gasps, long before the empty aisle revealed itself as a stage for betrayal, I had already begun to prepare for a possibility I never wanted to face. There was a part of me, small but insistent, that had always suspected he was not the man he claimed to be, and that part of me refused to sit idly by without some measure of protection. Perhaps it was instinct, perhaps it was self-preservation, or perhaps it was the quiet wisdom of a woman who had loved too deeply not to sense when love had soured. Whatever it was, I had collected fragments of truth, tucking them away like seeds in the soil, waiting for the day they might be needed. When he walked out of the ceremony, those seeds became roots, and my plan, once a shadow of possibility, began to take shape with frightening clarity. It had started months before, when the first real doubt flickered in my mind like the faint light beneath a closed door. I remembered the night vividly. He had returned home late, far later than he said he would, his shirt creased in ways that no desk chair could explain, his cologne stronger than usual, as though it had been reapplied rather than faded with time. His phone, carelessly tossed onto the nightstand, lit up with a message while he was in the shower, and though I did not mean to look, my eyes betrayed me. The name displayed was unfamiliar, a simple Tom Office, but the words beneath it were unmistakably intimate, a message no man would receive from another man. Not in that tone, not with those words. By the time he returned, the message had vanished, replaced by a lock screen as though nothing had happened. I said nothing, but that night I made a quiet decision. I would no longer ignore the whispers in my mind, so I began to collect. The first things were simple: receipts left in his pockets, small notes of times and places that did not match his explanations. I tucked them into a box beneath my bed, hidden between old photographs and forgotten books. Later, when patterns began to emerge, I grew bolder. I printed out emails he had left open on the shared laptop, messages written with the carelessness of someone who believed himself too clever to be caught. I photographed the entries on his calendar when I saw them flash across his screen, the ones marked with vague terms that did not align with the life we were supposedly building together. I told myself I was gathering these things only for my own sanity, proof to reconcile the unease inside me. But as the weeks turned into months, the box grew heavier, and so did the weight of what I carried in silence. When he proposed, when he placed the ring on my finger and looked at me with that practiced expression of devotion, I almost laughed at the audacity of it. By then, I knew enough to understand that his promises were not pure, yet I still wanted to believe. My heart and my mind waged a war, one side begging me to accept the life he painted for us, the other reminding me of the truth I had buried in that box. I said yes, but the yes was layered with caution. It was not surrender. It was strategy, because part of me understood that if he could betray me so easily, then I could not simply trust him with the power to define my future. I needed to be ready. The closer we came to the wedding, the clearer it became that his duplicity was not a fleeting weakness, but a second life he guarded with precision. I noticed the way his phone never left his side, the way he grew defensive if I so much as glanced in its direction. I noticed the calls he would take outside, his voice low, his words clipped. I noticed the sudden interest in grooming, in clothes, in details he had long ignored during our years together. And though my heart ached, my resolve hardened. If he thought he could juggle two realities without consequence, he was mistaken. My plan was not revenge, not at first. It was simply survival, a way to ensure that if the shadow ever stepped into the light, I would not be destroyed by it. But as I stood in that hall, bouquet in hand, watching the space where he should have been, the plan shifted. It was no longer about protecting myself. It was about reclaiming power. He had chosen to humiliate me in front of every person we knew, but what he had not realized was that I had already armed myself with truths capable of unraveling the illusion he had built. He thought his betrayal would be the end of my story, but I knew now it would be the beginning of his undoing. I spent the days after the failed wedding in silence, letting the world believe I was grieving, when in reality I was organizing. I laid out the receipts, the photographs, the emails, arranging them into a timeline that revealed his duplicity in brutal clarity. I contacted a friend who worked in the same company, asking careful questions until the pieces aligned. I even reached out to a woman I suspected was more than a colleague, crafting my words with precision, testing her responses until the truth spilled between the lines. What I had suspected all along became undeniable. He had not only betrayed me, he had built an entire parallel existence, one stitched together with lies and arrogance. And so the plan became more than a quiet archive of proof. It became a weapon. I began to imagine the moment when the truth would no longer remain hidden in my box, when it would be revealed not only to me but to the world he had so carefully deceived. I thought of the faces of our families, the colleagues who respected him, the friends who praised him, and I realized that the stage he had abandoned could still be mine. He believed he had stolen the story, but I was already rewriting it. The plan was meticulous not because I longed for revenge, but because I understood that justice, when wielded carefully, can cut deeper than any sword of emotion. He had walked away minutes before our vows, but he had not escaped me. He had handed me the ending he believed I could not survive, and in doing so, he gave me the beginning I needed. My plan, born of suspicion, nurtured in silence, was ready to unfold. All that remained was the timing, and I would not rush it, because the one thing betrayal teaches you, more than anything else, is patience. And my patience, though long tested, was about to become the very thing that destroyed him. When the dust of the failed wedding had settled, and the world believed me to be cloistered away in humiliation, licking wounds that he had so generously inflicted, I was, in truth, sharpening silence into something sharper than any scream. The plan I had been quietly crafting over months now pulsed with urgency, but I knew I could not unleash it all at once. No, precision mattered more than passion, and to truly dismantle him, I needed him to feel the edges of fear before the blade cut deep. Fear, after all, is a slow poison. It corrodes confidence long before the final strike. That was why I chose not to confront him with shouts or accusations, but with subtleties, carefully woven words that seemed harmless to any outsider, yet carried the weight of inevitability for the guilty. The first time I saw him again was days after the ceremony, when he arrived unannounced at the apartment we had shared. He carried no flowers, no apology, only a strange mix of arrogance and unease, as though he believed he might still control the narrative if he appeared casual enough. His eyes searched mine for tears, for the weakness he expected, but what he found was composure so cold it unsettled him. I invited him inside without resistance, offering him the seat across from me, the same table where we had once planned our lives together. I served him coffee, my hands steady, my voice calm. It was then, when he relaxed ever so slightly, believing I was resigned, that I let the first hint slip. "You left before the vows," I said softly, almost conversationally, as if recounting a small mishap. It's interesting, isn't it, how people can keep vows in private but fail to do so in public, almost as if they're already broken long before the moment arrives. His hand, midway to his cup, faltered, the porcelain clinking faintly against the saucer. The words were simple, devoid of direct accusation, but his eyes betrayed him. He shifted in his seat, forced a laugh, called it nerves, and tried to move on. But I had seen the tremor in his hand, the way his jaw clenched ever so slightly. That was enough. In the days that followed, I repeated this pattern. Each encounter became an opportunity to feed him fragments of knowledge he could not measure. At a family dinner, when relatives awkwardly avoided the subject of the wedding, I smiled and said, "Some truths have a way of surfacing at the most unexpected times." The words slipped into the air like harmless philosophy, but I watched his fork pause against the plate, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the handle. He excused himself early that evening, unable to endure the weight of eyes he imagined were seeing through him. Another time, when he called me to insist that we could work things out, his voice thick with a mixture of guilt and entitlement, I responded with a calm that chilled even me. "It's remarkable," I said, "how some people think they can live two lives without realizing how fragile their lies are. It only takes one small crack for everything to collapse." There was silence on the other end of the line, heavy and telling, before he muttered something about not understanding me, and hung up abruptly. I did not need him to understand. I only needed him to wonder how much I knew. Each subtle hint became a thread woven into his unraveling. He began to appear restless, distracted, his once confident demeanor replaced by unease. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he seemed jumpy at work, snapping at colleagues, retreating into himself. The man who once thrived on control now lived in constant calculation, questioning what I had seen, what I had kept, what I might reveal. I gave him no clarity. Ambiguity became my ally, and in that ambiguity, fear grew wild. What struck me most was how easily guilt performed its own work. I did not need to shout, to accuse, to hurl evidence across a table. His conscience, or what was left of it, did that for me. Every carefully chosen phrase, every calm look, every deliberate pause was a mirror held up to his own deception, forcing him to see the reflection he had long tried to bury. And though he tried to maintain the facade, each tremor, each glance away, each nervous laugh betrayed him more than any confession could. It was not cruelty that guided me, though some might see it as such. It was necessity. For years, I had been the woman who overlooked, who forgave, who silenced her doubts in the name of love. Now, I was the woman who planted seeds of truth with patience, who let fear do the heavy lifting that tears never could. By the time I truly confronted him, by the time the public revelation arrived, I wanted him already hollowed out by dread, his arrogance crumbled, his lies trembling on the edge of exposure. The first hints I gave him were not weapons in themselves. They were whispers of a storm he could not stop, and in watching him tremble under words that seemed so small, I realized the greatest power lay not in screaming the truth, but in letting him destroy himself slowly, one fearful heartbeat at a time. He had underestimated me, as he always had, but now he knew, even if only in fragments, that I was no longer the silent woman who ignored the signs. I was the architect of his unraveling, and he could already feel the ground shifting beneath him. The decision to expose him did not come in a moment of rage, but in the slow, deliberate way frost overtakes a window pane. Quiet, steady, undeniable. By the time I chose the occasion, the plan had already lived inside me for weeks, rehearsed in silence as I observed the shifts in his behavior, the tremors that betrayed his fear, whenever I let my words carry the suggestion that I knew more than I had revealed. He had begun to live inside the prison of his own lies, glancing over his shoulder, second-guessing every casual conversation, wondering if each shared glance between others meant the truth had reached them. But suspicion alone was not enough. The whispers I had given him were preludes. What remained was the crescendo, the moment where shadows became substance, and the world saw him not as the man he pretended to be, but as the man he truly was. I chose the stage carefully. It would not be behind closed doors, not whispered in secrecy, but in the full light of witnesses who once praised him. It would be public, undeniable, irreversible. The occasion presented itself almost too perfectly. A family celebration, one of those gatherings where blood and obligation draw people together, where laughter competes with old grudges and pride is displayed like fine china. He was there, of course, playing the role he always played, smiling too broadly, shaking hands with a charm honed to perfection, as if the disaster of our abandoned wedding had been nothing but an unfortunate hiccup. To those who did not know, he was still the man of potential, still the golden groom who had lost his way for a moment, but could be redeemed. That mask sickened me, but it also fueled me, because I knew how easily masks could be torn away when truth was given its voice. I did not arrive alone. I brought with me the quiet box of truths I had cultivated, receipts, messages, photographs, every piece of his duplicity preserved with the care of a historian archiving an empire's downfall. I had rehearsed how I would present them, not as a scorned woman clawing for sympathy, but as a prosecutor unveiling evidence so irrefutable that no one could look away. As the evening wore on and the conversations grew warm with wine and nostalgia, I waited. Timing mattered. To reveal too soon would be to risk dismissal. To reveal too late would lessen the impact. I waited until the moment when attention was gathered, when glasses were raised for a toast, when silence stretched long enough to hold words that would echo far beyond that room. He stood at the center, his glass lifted, his voice carrying with practiced ease as he spoke of family, of resilience, of beginnings. The hypocrisy of it nearly burned me alive, but I let him finish, let him bathe in the admiration of those who still believed. And then, before the clinking of glasses could fill the air, I stepped forward. My own glass remained untouched in my hand, as I let my voice cut through the expectant silence. Beginnings, I said, calm and clear, are only honest when built on truth. But what do we call it when beginnings are built on lies? The room froze. His smile faltered, confusion flashing for the briefest moment, before recognition shadowed his features. He tried to laugh, to brush it aside, but I was already opening the folder I had carried with me. the pages sliding free like the turning of a verdict. I did not need to shout. My voice, even measured, carried across the room as I held up the first receipt, the first photograph, the first email, each one a stone placed in the wall of his exposure. Gasps punctuated my words, the kind of sharp intakes of breath that slice through even the densest atmosphere. Guests leaned forward, eyes widening as the pieces assembled into a picture they could not deny. He moved toward me once, a hand half raised as if to snatch the papers away, but I stepped back, my gaze steady, my posture unshaken. You walked away from vows, I continued, but the truth is you broke them long before that day, and while you thought I would stand silent, carrying the shame alone, tonight I return it to where it belongs, on you. The murmurs grew louder, voices overlapping in disbelief, in anger, in shame that they had been fooled by his mask. I saw his parents' faces blanch, his colleagues shift uncomfortably, his friends avert their eyes. The weight of judgment, once directed toward me, turned fully onto him, crushing in its unanimity. The silence that followed was not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of recognition. He stammered. He tried to explain, to weave excuses as he always had, but the evidence lay before them, undeniable. The words that once charmed now fell empty. The laughter that once disarmed now rang hollow. And for the first time, he stood naked in the truth of his own making, stripped of the illusions he had cultivated so carefully. I did not cry. I did not shout. I let the evidence speak louder than any outburst could. And as the reality of who he was settled over the room, I saw the shift in every pair of eyes. The groom they had once admired was gone, replaced by the liar I had always suspected. He had believed the power was his when he left me at the altar, that he had written the story as one of abandonment. But in that room, in front of every guest who once celebrated us, I rewrote it. The story was no longer about me being left. It was about him being revealed. The applause never came, of course. This was not theater. It was truth, raw and unadorned. But the silence itself was its own verdict, heavier than any ovation could have been. And as he stood trembling, the glass still in his hand but forgotten, I knew the reveal had struck deeper than any revenge could. For it was not my voice alone that condemned him. It was the collective realization of everyone who bore witness. And once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. The night of the reveal did not end with silence alone. Silence may have been the first verdict, but the aftermath became the slow, grinding collapse of everything he thought he had built. Betrayal thrives in shadows. It survives so long as it can remain hidden, whispered, excused, or denied. Once dragged into the light, however, it begins to rot visibly, its decay spreading too fast to be ignored. That is what happened after the evidence left my hands and filled the minds of every guest who had once cheered for him. The illusion he had constructed so carefully over months, perhaps years, was now cracked beyond repair, and from those cracks poured every insecurity, every accusation, every poisonous doubt that he and his so-called new beginning had tried to suppress. It began with her. She had not been present at the family gathering, but word travels faster than fire in dry grass, and by the following day she knew. Whether through whispers of colleagues, the fury of his parents, or the messages that surely circulated among friends, the truth landed in her lap in fragments too heavy to ignore. I imagine her scrolling through the screenshots, her name tangled in messages she had once believed were private, her face perhaps captured in the photographs I had held back until that night. She had entered the affair under the illusion that she was special, that she was chosen, that she had somehow won him from me. What she learned instead was that she was a character in a story of deceit, just another layer of lies in a house already built on crumbling foundations. Their collapse did not explode in fiery arguments at first. It eroded slowly, insidiously, as trust gave way to suspicion. I heard of it through the same web of whispers that had carried his betrayal to me months before. She began questioning his every word, his late arrivals, his excuses that now rang as hollow to her as they had once rung to me. Every message he sent was scrutinized, every absence catalogued, every explanation doubted. Where once she had believed his declarations of devotion, now she heard only the echoes of the same declarations he had given me, realizing that recycled promises carry no meaning when they are spread too thin. I imagined the scenes unfolding with a detached clarity, her voice raised, demanding answers, his voice strained, insisting that I was lying, that the evidence had been twisted, that I had fabricated it all out of bitterness. But the problem with evidence is that it leaves marks. Receipts stamped with times and dates, messages archived in servers beyond control, photographs that cannot be denied. She may have wanted to believe him, but her own instincts, sharpened by the humiliation of being exposed, began to betray him. What once was passion turned into poison, and soon their every interaction became an argument, a tug of war not for love, but for dominance in a crumbling castle. Friends told me, in half-whispered confidences, that he had been seen leaving her apartment in the middle of the night, his face drawn, his eyes shadowed, as if sleep had become a stranger. Colleagues spoke of his temper flaring in meetings, his composure unraveling when questions too close to home were raised. The man who once walked with arrogance now carried himself with the uneasy gait of someone always expecting another blow. And she, the woman he thought would be his salvation, was no longer a partner, but an adversary, hurling his lies back at him with every opportunity, her anger fueled not just by betrayal, but by the realization that she had been complicit in the destruction of someone else's life. The collapse reached its crescendo one evening when, by chance or perhaps fate, I happened to cross paths with them both. It was in a restaurant, a place we had once frequented together, and as I entered, I felt their eyes on me before I even saw them. They were seated near the back, their table cluttered with untouched food, their faces tense with the aftermath of words spoken too sharply. I did not approach, did not offer acknowledgement, but I saw it in her expression. The dawning clarity, the bitter recognition that the man across from her was not the prize she had imagined, but the ruin of her own judgment. She looked at me not with hostility but with something closer to shame, as if realizing she had stood on the wrong side of a story now too public to escape. He, on the other hand, could not meet my gaze. His eyes darted down to his plate, his shoulders slumped, the arrogance gone. In that instant, I knew the illusion had fully collapsed. They did not last long after that. Whatever fragile threads held them together were cut one by one, until all that remained was resentment. She accused him of using her, of lying not only to me but to her as well, of dragging her into a scandal that scorched her reputation. He accused her of betrayal, of disloyalty, of failing to stand beside him when the world turned against him. But the truth was simple. Their bond had never been love, only deceit. And deceit cannot survive once the curtain is torn down, and the audience sees the wires, the paint, the falsity of the act. From a distance, I watched it crumble, not with glee, but with a strange sense of inevitability. This was the natural consequence of building a life on lies. It collapses under its own weight. I did not need to intervene further. They destroyed each other in ways far more complete than anything I could have orchestrated. And in that destruction, I found confirmation that my silence had been my greatest weapon, that truth left to grow in the open air becomes the fiercest executioner. By the time their relationship ended, he was not the man who had once left me at the altar, striding away with the confidence of someone who believed he held the upper hand. He was smaller, diminished, his name spoken with derision, his reputation frayed, his arrogance reduced to whispers of pity and scorn. The collapse of his new illusion was complete, and though he may have thought it was I who had set it in motion, the reality was simpler. He had built it himself, brick by brick, lie by lie, until it caved in on him. The collapse of his new illusion might have ended with the shattering of a relationship built on deceit, but that was only the first fracture. The true destruction came in waves, rippling outward from the center of his lies, until they touched every corner of his life. What he had once held as untouchable, his career, his finances, his social standing, began to unravel piece by piece, each loss heavier than the last, until he was no longer the man who had abandoned me at the altar, but a hollow remnant of arrogance dismantled by truth. I had prepared for this, not with malice, but with precision, because betrayal left unpunished only breeds repetition. I wanted him to feel the weight of every consequence, to know that lies do not vanish into thin air, but return, sharper and more destructive than when they were first told. His professional life was the first to suffer. He had always prided himself on his reputation at work, on being the dependable colleague, the charming negotiator, the man who could talk his way into opportunities others only dreamed of. That facade had already begun to crumble the moment his name was whispered at the family gathering, but it was the evidence I had carefully placed in the right hands that ensured the ruins spread beyond rumor. I knew exactly where to send the documents, exactly which chain of command would find them impossible to ignore. The emails I had printed, laced with implications of dishonesty, not only in love, but in business. The receipts that hinted at misused company resources, the photographs that placed him where he claimed never to have been. All of it became a dossier too damning to dismiss. Within weeks, the man who once walked into his office with confidence found himself cornered in meetings, questioned by superiors who no longer smiled at his excuses, scrutinized by colleagues who once praised him. He tried, of course, to laugh it off, to paint me as the bitter ex-fiancé desperate for revenge, but the evidence did not bend to his charm. Numbers, dates, times, they do not care for charisma. And when the board placed him under formal review, when whispers of demotion became louder than whispers of praise, I knew his career was no longer the pillar he had thought it was. The financial blow followed swiftly. The apartment we had shared, half in my name and half in his, became another battlefield he could not win. I withdrew my claim with a quiet precision that forced him to take on the full burden of payments he could no longer afford. Accounts that he had once held jointly with me were frozen, redirected, stripped of the security my trust had once given him. The life of dinners, gifts, and indulgences he had lived so freely became unsustainable without me as the silent foundation. I did not need to strip him of wealth. I only needed to remove myself from the equation, and the weight of his own extravagance crushed him. Socially, the consequences spread faster than either of us could have predicted. Once the story of his betrayal escaped the confines of family whispers, it took on a life of its own. Friends distanced themselves, not only out of loyalty to me, but out of fear of association with someone so publicly exposed. Invitations ceased, gatherings grew quiet without his presence, and those who once championed him began to speak of him with disdain. The image he had tried to protect, of a man admired and respected, was tarnished beyond repair. Even those who might have forgiven him could not unsee the evidence I had revealed. In their eyes, he was no longer a groom-to-be with promise, but a liar who had walked out on vows before they were even spoken. Perhaps the cruelest blow came from his own family. Parents who had once doted on him now looked at him with disappointment, etched deep in their features. Siblings who had celebrated his engagement with joy now avoided his calls. The pride he had carried, the sense of being their favored son, evaporated under the weight of shame. And though they never said it to his face, I knew from whispered confidences that they blamed him not only for betraying me, but for disgracing them all in front of witnesses who would never forget. Through it all, I remained silent. I did not need to hurl insults, did not need to gloat. Silence became my weapon, my presence and absence louder than any words I could have spoken. Every time he tried to paint me as vindictive, my calm refusal to engage only deepened his isolation. People believed me not because I shouted, but because I had already shown them the truth. And truth, once seen, does not fade. The man who had walked away from me at the altar, thinking himself triumphant, was now cornered by consequences he had never anticipated. He had underestimated me, underestimated the strength of patience, underestimated the power of quiet resolve, and as I watched from a distance, I realized the final blow was not the evidence I had revealed, nor the losses he had suffered, but the fact that he had destroyed himself. I had only held up the mirror. By the time the dust settled, his career was fractured, his finances strained, his reputation shredded, his family estranged. He had believed that abandoning me minutes before our vows would define me, but instead it defined him. He was no longer the man who had left. I was. I had walked out, not from the ceremony, but from the life he thought he controlled. And in doing so, I had left him with nothing but the ruins of his own making. When I think back to that hall, the one adorned with flowers that never fulfilled their purpose, the one where whispers replaced vows, I no longer see it as the place where I was abandoned, but as the place where I was reborn. At the time, it had felt like the sharpest of endings, a humiliation too vast to comprehend. Yet as days turned to weeks, and weeks into the quiet unfolding of months, I began to understand that what he had intended as my undoing had instead become my beginning. The moment he walked away, I did not collapse, and that refusal became the foundation for everything that followed. What might have been remembered as tragedy evolved into testimony, proof of a resilience I had not realized lived within me until it was called forth by betrayal. I left that hall with my bouquet still intact, the stems pressed so firmly into my palms that they left marks long after the flowers had withered. At first, those marks felt like scars, reminders of a day that had ended in silence instead of celebration. But as time passed, I began to see them differently, not as wounds, but as symbols, proof that I had held on when everything else had threatened to fall. The bouquet had not tumbled to the ground, and neither had I. It became almost a metaphor I carried with me, the choice not to let go, the refusal to give the world the spectacle of my collapse. And in that refusal, strength grew, slow but undeniable, like roots beneath the surface of scorched earth. The world, of course, tried to define me in its own way. At first, I was the woman who had been left, the bride abandoned, the subject of pity disguised as sympathy. People tilted their heads when they saw me, voices lowered, eyes softened with what they believed was compassion. But I rejected their narrative as surely as I had rejected his. I was not the broken one, not the victim. I had been the witness to truth, and truth had freed me. So I learned to walk with my head high, to let their whispers fall away, to let silence speak where explanations were demanded. Slowly, those whispers shifted. They stopped speaking of me as the abandoned one, and began to speak of me as the one who had stood unbroken, who had faced the storm with composure, who had exposed deception without tearing herself apart in the process. In the quiet that followed his ruin, I found myself again. For too long, my life had been tethered to his orbit, my dreams bent to fit the shape of his ambition, my silence pressed into service for his lies. But without him, I rediscovered the space to breathe, to think, to choose. I pursued projects I had once put aside, reconnected with friends I had neglected, rebuilt the pieces of my life not as fragments of what we had been, but as new structures entirely my own. There was no rush in this rebuilding. It was steady, deliberate, as if each choice I made was a brick laid in the foundation of a life I would not surrender again. What surprised me most was the absence of bitterness. At first, I thought I would carry anger forever, that the betrayal would burn endlessly. But anger, like fire, consumes everything it touches if left unchecked. Instead, I let it burn only long enough to light the way forward, and then I let the embers die. In their place grew something sharper than vengeance, clarity. I no longer needed to wonder what if, no longer needed to question whether I had imagined the signs, no longer needed to bind myself to a man who had proven himself unworthy. The collapse of his illusion had also been the collapse of my own, and from those ruins, I was free. I often think of the moment I chose not to collapse, standing before a room full of eyes waiting for me to break. That moment defined me more than any ceremony could have. For vows are promises spoken aloud, but strength is a vow kept in silence, when no one else can hear it but yourself. I had vowed to myself that I would not be undone, and I had kept it. That vow carried me through the revelation, through the exposure, through the slow crumbling of the man who had once believed himself powerful. And in keeping it, I discovered that the truest vows are not given to another, but to oneself. So when I say I left the hall stronger than I entered, I do not mean I walked out with confidence blazing in my eyes. I left with trembling hands, with a heart heavy from betrayal, with a body weighed down by a dress that felt like a shroud. But I also left with resolve, with patience, with a plan, and with the unshakable truth that I had survived what should have broken me. Strength is not born in triumph. It is born in endurance, in the quiet choice to rise when falling would be easier. Now, when people ask me about that day, I no longer flinch. I tell them not about the man who walked away, but about the woman who did not. I tell them about the bouquet that never fell, about the silence that turned into strength, about the truth that unraveled lies more thoroughly than anger ever could. I tell them that the wedding they thought was the end was, for me, the beginning. And I tell them that sometimes the greatest gift betrayal gives is the chance to begin again, not as half of a whole, but as someone entire, someone free. He thought leaving me would define my life as a story of loss. Instead, it defined his as a story of ruin. And mine, the one I write now each day with choices entirely my own, is a story not of abandonment, but of ascension. I did not lose that day. I walked away stronger, and I have never looked back.